The metal of the key felt biting and cold against my palm as I tried the lock for the third time. It would not turn. I leaned my weight into the heavy oak door of my childhood home, but the deadbolt was unyielding, a solid barrier between me and the life I had known for 3 decades. Through the narrow pane of decorative glass, I could see my brother Marcus standing in the center of the living room. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, his silhouette sharp against the warm glow of the lamps I had polished just last week. He didn't look at me. He didn't even flinch at the sound of my frantic knocking. 2 days after our parents' funeral, my brother had changed the locks. The rain began as a soft, rhythmic patter against the porch roof before shifting into a steady, cold downpour. I stepped back, my breath hitching as I looked at the lawn. Dozens of cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly near the driveway, their edges already beginning to soften and sag under the weight of the water. My whole life was sitting in those boxes. My books, my clothes, and my nursing school diploma were being claimed by the mud. Marcus finally approached the door, but he did not open it. He only stood behind the screen, his face cast in shadows. A function. I was the daughter, which meant I was a burden until I could be married off and become someone else's problem. Marcus had absorbed that worldview like it was holy scripture. He had watched our father spend weekends in the garage teaching him to build things while I was kept in the kitchen. He had his business degree at UConn paid for in full, while I was told that girls didn't need expensive educations. I had to work double shifts at a diner and fight for scholarships just to become a nurse. Now, despite all my work and all my sacrifice, Marcus was inside the warmth of the house, and I was standing in the rain with nothing but the wet boxes on the grass. My name is Brianna Mercer. I am 32 years old. I have endured 32 years in a family that treated me like an extra chair at the table, a temporary guest in my own bloodline. I thought I knew the depths of my brother's greed, but I was wrong. He truly believed I was worthless. He thought that by throwing my belongings onto the lawn, he was finally purging the Mercer name of its only weakness. But there was something Marcus didn't know. He didn't know that for 8 years, our mother had been watching the way he and my father looked at me. He didn't know that she had spent nearly a decade in secret meetings with lawyers, building a wall around me that he could never tear down. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, scratched metal of my mother's Timex watch. It was the one thing Marcus had missed when he was tossing my life into the mud. It wasn't a fancy watch like his Rolex, but it was accurate, and it was hers. I looked at the wet boxes and saw a cream-colored envelope sticking out of a container filled with her old gardening gloves. My name was written on it in her shaky, post-chemo handwriting. Even in the middle of my grief and the stinging betrayal of my brother, I felt a flicker of something else. It was a cold, quiet realization. They thought this was the end of my story, but they had no idea that my mother was about to have the last word from beyond the grave. I need to pause here for a moment because I have to know something. Have you ever been made to feel like you were taking up space that belonged to someone worthier? Have you ever had a family member look you in the eye and tell you that you deserved nothing simply because of who you were? That feeling of being invisible in your own home is a weight that stays with you forever. If this is hitting close to home for you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts, and tell me where you are watching from right now. I read every single one of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now might be the time. Because what my mother left in that cream-colored envelope was about to dismantle everything Marcus thought he owned. The rain didn't stop, but I stopped shaking. I picked up the box containing my mother's recipe cards and her old photographs, the items Marcus must have assumed were junk. I didn't open the letter on the lawn. I couldn't bear to let the rain touch her words. Instead, I called the only person who had ever treated me like a professional and a peer, the head nurse at my workplace. As I waited for her to arrive, I looked up at the window of the colonial house one last time. I saw the silhouette of Marcus's wife, Victoria, holding her phone up to the glass. She was probably taking a photo for her social media, a memory of the new house she thought she had just inherited. She lifted her wine glass in a mock toast when she saw me watching. To understand how a worthless daughter ended up with everything, you have to understand the foundation of the Mercer family. You have to understand the four-bedroom house in the suburbs and the lavender garden in the backyard that my mother tended every single morning. My father, Robert Mercer, was a successful contractor who believed that the world belonged to men who built things with their hands. He wasn't a monster who screamed. He was a man who simply allocated his attention to the person he thought mattered most. For 32 years, that person was Marcus. I was just the background noise, the girl who would eventually marry well and disappear into someone else's name. That was the plan, at least. But plans have a way of changing when you underestimate the quietest person in the room. The heater in Sarah's old Honda Civic hummed with a low, mechanical rattle that usually annoyed me, but tonight it felt like the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. I sat in the passenger seat, my damp jeans clinging to my legs and the smell of wet wool filling the small space. Sarah didn't ask questions. She just drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at me with a look of profound, silent pity that I couldn't quite meet. I stared out the window at the blurred streetlights of our town, watching the golden orbs smear against the glass as the wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge. My mind was a frantic loop of Marcus's face and the sound of that deadbolt sliding home. It was final. It was cold. It was him. I reached into my bag and pulled out the cream-colored envelope I had rescued from the mud. The paper was slightly warped from the moisture, the edges soft and pulsing under my fingertips. I didn't open it yet. I just held it. I remember a Saturday afternoon 10 years ago when my father sat Marcus down at the heavy mahogany desk in the study. I was standing in the hallway, holding a tray of sandwiches I'd made, and I heard my father tell him that the house, the business, and the legacy were his to protect. He told Marcus that a man's worth is measured by what he holds, and a woman's worth is measured by who she supports. I had stood there, the weight of the tray making my arms ache, and realized that in that room, in that life, I was invisible. I was a ghost in my own home. I left the sandwiches on the hall table and walked away. No one noticed. Sarah pulled into her driveway and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I felt my chest tighten, a sharp, localized pain right behind my sternum that made every breath feel like a chore. I gripped the envelope tighter. My hands were finally still, but my heart was racing. Sarah put a hand on my shoulder, her touch warm through my damp shirt. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was fine. It was a lie. I wasn't fine. I was hollowed out, a shell of a person whose history had just been tossed into a dumpster. But as I looked at my mother's handwriting on that envelope, a different feeling began to stir beneath the shock. It was a low, slow-burning heat. It was resolve. We went inside, and the smell of Sarah's apartment, vanilla candles and old books, felt like a sanctuary. I went into her guest bathroom and stripped off my wet clothes, watching the steam from the shower rise and cloud the mirror. I avoided looking at my reflection. I didn't want to see the girl who had been discarded. I stood under the hot water until my skin turned pink, trying to wash away the feeling of the rain and the look on Victoria's face as she toasted my exile. When I finally stepped out and wrapped myself in a borrowed robe, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the letter. The first line of the letter didn't start with a greeting. It started with a confession. My mother wrote that she knew what Robert and Marcus were planning long before the cancer even took hold. She wrote about the secret bank accounts she had maintained for decades, the small percentages she had skimmed from the household budget, and the inheritance from her own grandmother that my father thought had been lost in a bad investment. She had been building a fortress for me in the dark. She told me that I was the heartbeat of that family, even if the men were too deaf to hear it. She told me to call a man named Elias Sterling. He was a lawyer my father didn't know, a man who specialized in the kind of ironclad trusts that even the most aggressive contractor couldn't break. I remembered the way she used to look at me during those long nights in the hospital. Her eyes would be clouded with pain, but occasionally they would clear, and she would squeeze my hand with a strength that seemed impossible for her frail frame. She would whisper that everything was going to be okay, that I just had to be patient. I thought she was comforting me about her death. I thought she was trying to make the end easier to bear. I realized now she was talking about the beginning. She was talking about the moment the house would fall. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling of Sarah's guest room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus. I saw him walking through our mother's kitchen, probably already planning where to put a new wine fridge or how to knock down the wall of the pantry she loved. I felt a surge of nausea. He didn't deserve that house. He didn't deserve the memories attached to the crown molding or the way the sun hit the breakfast nook at 7 in the morning. He saw the house as an asset. I saw it as a sanctuary. He saw me as a liability. I saw him as a thief. The next morning, the sun came out with a mocking brightness. I sat at Sarah's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, my phone in my hand. I dialed the number for Elias Sterling. My voice was steady when he answered, a sharp contrast to the way my insides felt like they were vibrating. I told him who I was. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long, thoughtful silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. Then Mr. Sterling spoke. His voice was like aged leather, rough, durable, and expensive. He told me he had been waiting for my call. He told me that the will reading was scheduled for the following afternoon at my father's old firm. He told me to wear something that made me feel powerful. I hung up the phone and looked at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. The grief was still there, a heavy, suffocating blanket, but the purpose was sharper. I thought about the boxes on the lawn. I thought about my nursing degree sitting in the mud. I thought about the way Marcus had looked through me like I was made of glass. He wanted a war based on the old rules. He wanted a fight where the son always wins because the father said so. But he didn't realize that the world had changed while he was busy checking his watch. He didn't realize that our mother had spent her final years ensuring that the old rules no longer applied. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I saw the girl on the porch in the rain, and I felt sorry for her, but I didn't recognize her anymore. That girl was gone. The woman standing in Sarah's kitchen was someone else. She was a Mercer, yes, but she wasn't the kind of Mercer my father had envisioned. I was the product of my mother's silence and her strength. I was the consequence of their cruelty. I spent the afternoon at a local boutique, using the last of my savings to buy a suit. It was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with sharp lines that felt like armor. As the tailor pinned the sleeves, I thought about the injustice of it all. I remembered when I was 12 and I won the regional science fair. My father had looked at my trophy and then asked Marcus how his football practice went. He hadn't even touched the trophy. He hadn't even said well done. I remembered the heat of that rejection, the way it had tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I felt that same heat now, but it didn't burn me. It fueled me. Sarah drove me to the law firm the next day. The building was a glass and steel monolith in the center of the city, a place that screamed of old money and high-stakes decisions. As I stepped out of the car, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. I looked formidable. I looked like someone who belonged in a room where decisions were made. I took a deep breath, the air cold and crisp in my lungs. I walked into the lobby, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. I reached the elevators and pressed the button for the 12th floor. As the doors began to close, a hand reached out to stop them. The doors slid back open and Marcus stepped inside. He was wearing a navy suit and a smirk that made my stomach turn. He looked at me, his eyes traveling up and down my suit with a derisive glimmer. He told me I looked nice for a girl who was about to be homeless. He said he hoped I had found a nice shelter or a cheap apartment because the locks on the house were staying changed. I didn't say a word. I just looked straight ahead at the shifting numbers on the display. The elevator climbed higher, the silence between us thick and toxic. Marcus started humming a tuneless song, a habit he had when he felt he had already won. I felt the familiar pull of the old dynamics, the urge to shrink, to apologize, to fade into the background. But then I felt the weight of the letter in my pocket. I felt the ghost of my mother's hand on my shoulder. I didn't shrink. I stood taller. I watched the numbers climb. 12. The doors opened, and Marcus stepped out with a confident stride, clearly expecting me to follow like a stray dog. I waited a beat. I smoothed my jacket. Then, I walked out to meet the destiny my mother had written for me in the dark. The conference room was massive, dominated by a table that looked like it had been carved from a single, ancient tree. Victoria was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when we entered, her expression shifting from bored to annoyed when she saw me. She didn't speak. She just went back to her screen. At the head of the table sat Mr. Henderson, my father's longtime lawyer, a man who looked like he was made entirely of parchment and tradition. And in the corner, sitting quietly with a briefcase on his lap, was Elias Sterling. Marcus took the seat next to Mr. Henderson, leaning back with an air of ownership that made the air in the room feel thin. He gestured for me to sit at the far end of the table, as far away from the center of power as possible. I didn't sit where he pointed. I walked over to the chair directly across from him and sat down. I looked him in the eye and waited. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began to speak about my father's legacy, about the importance of family, and about the clear instructions Robert Mercer had left behind. Marcus's smirk widened. He looked like a man who had already spent the money. I felt my pulse thrumming in my fingertips, a steady, rhythmic reminder that I was alive. I looked at Elias Sterling, and he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. It was time. The reading of the will was about to begin, and with it, the end of the world Marcus thought he lived in. I wondered if he could feel the shift in the air. I wondered if he could sense that the invisible daughter was about to become the most important person in the room. I took a deep breath and centered myself. The game was finally starting. Would you like me to write part 3? Mr. Henderson's voice was a dry, rhythmic drone that seemed to suck the moisture right out of the air. He began by reading a long, tedious preamble about my father's life, his dedication to the family business, and his desire to see his hard-earned legacy continue through the proper channels. It was a verbal monument to a man who had spent 40 years building houses for other people while neglecting the emotional foundation of his own. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the mahogany table. The wood was cool and polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the fluorescent lights above us like long, white ribs. I focused on the texture of the grain. It was solid. Real. Unlike the lies being woven into the legal jargon, Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table, a position of dominance he had practiced since he was a teenager. He was nodding along to Henderson's words as if he were hearing a sermon. I could see the pulse in his neck, a steady, arrogant beat. He was already mentally measuring the square footage of the master bedroom for a new walk-in closet. Beside him, Victoria was picking at a loose thread on her designer handbag, her face a mask of bored expectation. She didn't even look at the documents. She knew the ending. Everyone in the room thought they knew the ending. Then came the meat of the document. Mr. Henderson adjusted his spectacles and began to list the assets. The commercial properties, the contracting firm, the investment portfolios, and, of course, the house. As each item was read, the beneficiary was the same. Marcus. 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 It was a total shutout. My father had written me out of his life with the surgical precision of a man who didn't want any loose ends. He left me a small, insulting sum of $10,000, specifically stating it was to assist in her transition to a life of her own. The room felt suddenly very small. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second, the edges of the room fraying into gray. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight, a heavy stone sitting on my chest that made every inhale a struggle. I remembered my 18th birthday. Marcus had been given a brand new Jeep, wrapped in a massive red bow that sat in the driveway like a taunt. I had been given a bus pass and a lecture on the importance of self-reliance. My father told me that day that a man needs a vehicle to conquer the world, but a woman only needs a way to get to work. I had swallowed the lump in my throat and thanked him, but the taste of that rejection had never truly left my mouth. It was bitter then. It was poisonous now. Marcus let out a long, satisfied exhale as Henderson finished reading the final page. He turned to me, his expression a mixture of false sympathy and triumphant malice. He told me that 10,000 was a generous gift, considering I hadn't contributed anything to the family's wealth. He said he'd give me a week to get the rest of my boxes off the lawn before he called a junk removal service. He actually reached out as if to pat my hand, but I pulled back before he could touch me. The air in the room was thick with his victory. "Is that all, Harold?" Marcus asked, his voice booming in the quiet room. Mr. Henderson began to gather his papers, but before he could slide them into his briefcase, Elias Sterling stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, the sound of his chair sliding back against the carpet like a low growl. Elias didn't look at Marcus. He looked directly at Mr. Henderson. He pulled a thick, blue-bound folder from his own briefcase and laid it on the table. The sound it made was heavy. "Final. Actually, Harold," Elias said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold front, "we have a matter of title and secondary estate that takes precedence over your client's wishes." Marcus laughed, a short, sharp sound that lacked any real humor. He told Elias he was wasting everyone's time and that the will was ironclad. He said our father was the sole owner of everything and that the little sister was just looking for a handout. I felt my jaw tighten. My teeth ached from the pressure. I looked at Elias, and he gave me a look that was as sharp as a razor. He told Marcus to be quiet and listen, or he'd find himself in contempt of a proceeding he didn't even realize had started. Elias opened the blue folder and began to read. He didn't read about legacies or hard work. He read about deeds. Specifically, the deed to the colonial house. He produced a document from 40 years ago, a gift of land and property from my maternal grandfather to my mother, Elena. It was a premarital asset, a piece of the world that my father had never actually owned. My mother had allowed him to think he controlled it, had allowed him to put his name on the utilities and the taxes, but the legal title had remained in her name and her name alone through a complex series of family trusts that my father had been too arrogant to investigate. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could hear the distant sound of a siren on the street below. Marcus's face began to change, the smugness draining away to reveal a pale, sickly gray. He looked at Mr. Henderson, but the older lawyer was staring at the documents Elias had provided with a look of genuine horror. Henderson's hands were shaking as he reached for his reading glass. He began to leaf through the pages, his mouth hanging slightly open. Elias continued, his voice steady and clinical. He explained that my mother had executed a new will 6 months before her death. In that will, she had exercised her right as the sole owner of the property and the majority of the family's liquid savings funds that my father had moved into her name years ago for tax sheltering purposes. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was hiding money from the government. He never realized he was handing the keys to the kingdom to the woman he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Everything changed in that moment. The house wasn't Marcus's. The savings accounts weren't his. Even the land the business stood on was part of the trust my mother had redirected. She had left the business to Marcus, but she had left the ground it sat on to me. She had left the house to me. She had left the majority of the liquid assets to me. I wasn't the daughter getting a $10,000 handout. I was the landlord. I was the owner. I was the one with the power. Marcus stood up so quickly his chair flipped over and hit the floor with a dull thud. He started to yell, his face turning a deep, angry purple. He called the documents fakes. He said I had manipulated our mother while she was drugged up on pain meds. He screamed that he was the son, the heir, the one who mattered. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. I didn't flinch. I sat there and watched him unravel. I watched the man who had locked me out in the rain become a person who was realizing he had nowhere to go. Victoria was frozen, her hand still hovering over her bag. Her social media dreams of the Mercer Mansion were evaporating in real time. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She hadn't married a mogul. She had married a man who was about to be evicted by his little sister. The power dynamic in their marriage shifted in that single, silent heartbeat. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to witness. The documents are fully notarized and filed with the state, Elias said, ignoring Marcus's outburst. The transition of ownership was triggered the moment the primary will was read. As of 10 minutes ago, Ms. Brianna Mercer is the sole owner of the residence at 1422 Oak Ridge Lane. Marcus, you and your wife are currently trespassing on her property. I looked at my brother. I remembered the way he had stood behind that screen door 2 nights ago. I remembered the coldness in his eyes when he told me I was nothing. I felt a surge of something powerful, a mixture of grief for the mother I had lost and a fierce, burning pride for the woman she had helped me become. I didn't scream at him. I didn't gloat. I just leaned forward, the same way he had earlier, and looked him in the eye. I told him I wanted the locks changed back by 5 o'clock. I told him that my boxes were to be moved back inside, and if a single item was damaged by the rain, I would subtract the cost from his share of the business profits. I told him that he had 2 hours to pack his bags and leave. He started to protest, his voice cracking, but I cut him off. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 32 years of being ignored. I told him that Dad might have decided sons inherit everything, but Mom decided that the truth was more important. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from a lack of conflict. It was the peace that comes from the end of a long, exhausting war. I looked at the table, at the documents that had rewritten my life. I thought about the lavender garden in the backyard. I thought about the way the light hit the breakfast nook at 7 in the morning. Those things were mine now. Not because I had stolen them, but because the person who truly loved me had made sure I was protected. Marcus slumped back against the wall, the wind completely gone from his sails. He looked small. He looked like the bully who had finally been stood up to. Victoria grabbed her bag and walked toward the door without saying a word to him. She didn't wait. She didn't offer him comfort. She just left. Marcus watched her go, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the rain. I remembered the sound of the deadbolt. I stood up and smoothed my gray suit. I thanked Mr. Henderson for his time and nodded to Elias. I walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking on the marble floor once again. But this time, the sound didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like a march. I was walking toward the house that was finally, legally, and spiritually mine. As I reached the elevator, I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah. She was asking how it went. I didn't reply with words. I just sent a photo of the blue folder. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the lobby and watched the doors close on the 12th floor. I was leaving the world of my father's legacy behind. I was entering a world of my own making. And as the elevator descended, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the fight or the legal battle. The hardest part was realizing that I had been worthy of this all along. My mother had known it. Elias had known it. Now, the whole world knew it. I walked out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different. It felt lighter. I took a deep breath and started walking toward my car. I had a lot of work to do. I had a house to reclaim. I had a life to build. And for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't a guest in someone else's story. I was the author. Would you like me to write part 4? The lobby of the law firm smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sterile scent of freshly printed paper, a sharp contrast to the earthy, petrichor smell of the rain-soaked lawn I had stood on just 48 hours prior. I walked across the polished granite floor, my movements fluid and deliberate, feeling the weight of the blue folder tucked firmly under my arm. Elias Sterling walked beside me, his presence a quiet, formidable shadow that commanded respect without saying a word. He stopped near the massive glass entrance and turned to me, his eyes sharp and analytical, yet devoid of the condescending pity I had received from Mr. Henderson. He told me that the next few hours would be the most difficult, and that Marcus would likely try every tactic in the book to delay the inevitable. He advised me to remain calm, stay focused on the law, and remember that I was no longer asking for permission to exist. I thanked him, and as I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the afternoon sun, I felt a strange, electric hum beneath my skin. The world looked different. The colors seemed more saturated, the air sharper, the sounds of the city more melodic than chaotic. I was no longer a ghost haunting the hallways of my own life. I was the architect of my future. I drove back to the house in a state of hyper-awareness, noticing the way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air of my car. My mind kept drifting back to a summer afternoon when I was 14, the year my father decided Marcus needed a private study to prepare for his future as a leader. I remember being told to move my things out of my bedroom, the room with a view of the lavender garden, and into the small, windowless guest room at the end of the hall. My father had said that a girl didn't need a view to do her homework, but a man needed space to think. I had spent that entire weekend carrying my books and my childhood treasures down the long corridor, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. Marcus had watched me from the doorway of his new suite, a smug, entitled grin on his face that I could still see if I closed my eyes. He hadn't offered to help. He had just stood there, claiming his territory. I felt that memory now, a cold, sharp stone in the pit of my stomach, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. It served as a reminder of why I was doing this. Justice wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming the space they had stolen from me, inch by agonizing inch. When I pulled onto Oak Ridge Lane, the sight of the colonial house made my heart skip a beat. It stood there, grand and indifferent, its white siding gleaming in the sun. But the driveway was a scene of utter chaos. My boxes were still there, though someone, likely a neighbor with more heart than my brother, had thrown a blue plastic tarp over them to protect them from the remaining dampness. As I stepped out of the car, I saw Marcus's black SUV parked haphazardly near the garage, and I could hear the muffled sound of shouting coming from inside the house. I didn't rush. I walked up the driveway with a measured pace, my heels crunching on the gravel. I stopped at the boxes first, pulling back a corner of the tarp to check on my things. The air smelled of wet cardboard and old memories. I saw the edge of a photo album I had managed to save, the plastic cover scratched but intact. I felt a surge of protectiveness. These were the fragments of my life that Marcus had deemed garbage. He was wrong. I reached the front porch and didn't bother knocking. I pulled the heavy brass key, the one Elias had given me, the one that matched the new locks my mother had secretly installed years ago and kept the spares of in a safe deposit box, and slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, mechanical click that felt like a symphony. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The house was a whirlwind of motion. Victoria was at the top of the stairs, screaming at a mover who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. She was clutching a designer floor lamp as if it were a holy relic, her face contorted in a mask of sheer rage. Marcus was in the living room, frantically throwing papers into a leather briefcase. He looked up when I entered, his eyes bloodshot and his tie undone. He looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide. He started to say something, his voice a ragged, desperate growl, but I held up my hand. I didn't want to hear his excuses. I didn't want to hear his threats. I told him he had 90 minutes left. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Marcus dropped the briefcase onto the coffee table, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged room. He told me that I was destroying the family and that our father would be turning in his grave if he could see what I was doing. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow core of the man he had become. He was a creature of entitlement, built on a foundation of sand that our father had provided. Without the house, without the money, he didn't know who he was. I told him that Dad had been turning in his grave since the moment he decided one of his children was worth less than the other based on a chromosome. I told him that I wasn't destroying the family. I was finally letting it breathe. Marcus took a step toward me, his hands balled into fists, but he stopped when he saw the locksmith standing in the driveway behind me. I had called ahead. I wasn't taking any chances. The next hour was a blur of calculated efficiency. I stood in the center of the foyer like a conductor, directing the locksmith to start with the back door and work his way forward. Victoria came down the stairs, trailing a suitcase that looked like it cost more than my first car. She stopped in front of me, her eyes narrow and filled with a venomous spite. She told me that I would never be happy in this house and that the walls would always remind me of how much my father hated me. I didn't blink. I told her that the walls would remind me of how much my mother loved me, and that was more than enough to keep the chill away. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh and marched out the door without looking back. She didn't wait for Marcus. She didn't offer to help him with the remaining boxes. She was a passenger in his life, and now that the ship was sinking, she was the first to hit the lifeboats. Marcus followed her a few minutes later, carrying his briefcase and a small box of his personal items from the study. He stopped at the threshold of the house, looking back at the living room with a look of profound loss. It wasn't the loss of a home, it was the loss of status. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to hide my dolls just to see me cry. I felt a fleeting, ghost-like pang of sadness for the relationship we never had, for the siblings we could have been if our father hadn't poisoned the well. But then I remembered the rain. I remembered the sound of the lock turning against me. The sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. I told him his time was up. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked out and slammed the door behind him. I stood in the foyer and listened to the sound of his SUV pulling away. The house was suddenly, profoundly quiet. It was the kind of silence that has a weight to it, a presence that fills the rooms like water. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the small breakfast table where I had fed my mother her broth during those final, difficult weeks. The sunlight was streaming through the window, illuminating the wood grain of the table. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling the nicks and scratches of 30 years of family meals. I felt a sob rise in my throat, not of grief, but of sheer, overwhelming relief. I was home. Truly home. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to ask anyone for permission to be there. I was the owner. I was the master. I was Brianna Mercer, and I had survived. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving my boxes back inside. Each trip from the driveway to the house felt like a victory lap. I carried my nursing books into the study, the room Marcus had just vacated, and stacked them on the shelves where his business trophies had once sat. I took my mother's recipe cards and placed them in the drawer next to the stove. I found the photo album and opened it to a picture of my mother in her garden, her face radiant and full of a quiet strength I was only now beginning to fully understand. I realized then that she hadn't just left me a house. She had left me a blueprint for how to fight back, without losing my soul. She had shown me that silence isn't weakness, it's a strategic advantage. She had played the long game, and she had won through me. As evening began to fall, I walked out to the lavender garden in the backyard. The scent was intoxicating, a sweet, herbal perfume that clung to the damp air. I knelt in the dirt and touched the soft, purple blooms. I remembered how my father used to complain about the waste of space the garden represented, how he wanted to pave it over for a bigger patio. My mother had always refused, her voice quiet but unyielding. Now I knew why. This garden was her sanctuary, the one place where she could grow something that was entirely hers. I felt a deep, soul-shaking connection to her in that moment. I whispered a thank you into the twilight, the words catching on the breeze. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. I knew Marcus would likely try to sue, to find some loophole, to make my life a living hell. But as I looked up at the house, my house, glowing with a soft, inviting light, I knew I was ready. I wasn't the girl in the rain anymore. I was the woman who had brought the storm. I went back inside and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt was different this time. It wasn't a barrier. It was a promise. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom, the room with the view of the garden, and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the letter from my mother one more time, the ink faded but the message clear. She had ended it with a simple sentence: live a life that is loud enough to drown out their silence. I closed my eyes and let the quiet of the house wrap around me like a warm blanket. I had so much to do tomorrow. I had to call the hospital and tell them I was coming back to work. I had to meet with Elias to finalize the trust paperwork. I had to start the process of reclaiming my life. But for tonight, I just wanted to sit in the stillness and listen to the heartbeat of my home. It was steady. It was strong. It was mine. Would you like me to write part 5? I woke up at 4 a.m. The house was breathing. In the master bedroom, the air felt different, thicker, more intentional, and weighted with a history I was finally allowed to own. For years, this room was a fortress I wasn't allowed to enter without a specific, service-oriented purpose. I was the one who brought the fresh linens. I was the one who emptied the trash. I was the help. Now, I was the inhabitant. I looked at the ceiling fan spinning slowly. Its rhythmic click-clack the only sound in the darkness. My father used to say that silence was for people who had nothing to contribute to the world. He was wrong. Silence is for people who are finally listening to the truth. I got out of bed and walked down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. I stopped at the door to Marcus's old study. The room still smelled of his expensive cigars and that heavy, musky cologne he wore like a suit of armor to hide his insecurities. I turned on the light. The walls were bare where his degrees and awards had hung, leaving behind pale rectangles on the wallpaper like ghost footprints. The desk was empty, save for a single, circular stain where his whiskey glass had rested during his late-night sessions of self-congratulation. I remembered a night 5 years ago when I had come in here to ask him for a small loan to help with my final semester of nursing school. I was working 60 hours a week between the hospital and the diner. I was exhausted. My eyes were bloodshot. Marcus hadn't even looked up from his ledger. He told me that if I couldn't manage my own finances, I shouldn't be responsible for people's lives. He told me to leave. I left. I didn't cry then. I won't cry now. I sat in his chair. It was too big for me, designed for a man who wanted to feel imposing while he signed away other people's futures. I reached into the back of the drawer and found a small, forgotten item, a gold-plated pen with my father's initials. I rolled it between my fingers. It felt cold. It felt useless. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. A car was parked at the end of the block, its lights off, a dark shape against the gray pre-dawn light. I knew it was him. Or someone he sent to watch the sister he had so casually discarded. Marcus wasn't a man who surrendered. He was a man who regrouped. The phone rang at 7 a.m. It was an unknown number, but I knew the cadence of the silence before the voice spoke. It was Marcus. His voice wasn't booming anymore. It was thin, reedy. He didn't lead with a threat. He led with a plea. He talked about the family image and the neighbors. He mentioned our cousins in Boston and how embarrassed they would be if they knew his sister had turned him out into the street like a common criminal. He actually used the word charity, as if it were a currency I owed him. I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest, but I suppressed it. I told him that charity starts at home, and since he had decided I didn't have a home, he shouldn't expect much from me. He snapped then. The mask of the civilized businessman crumbled. He called me a thief. He said he was filing an injunction by noon. He said the mommy trust wouldn't hold up in a real court, not when he showed the judge the medical records from her final months. He told me he was going to claim she wasn't of sound mind when she signed those papers. He was going to drag her name through the mud just to get the deed back. My hand tightened around the receiver. My knuckles were white. I told him to go ahead. I told him I had the video logs from the home care cameras. I had the records of every time I called him to come see her, and every time he declined because of a golf tournament or a crucial meeting. I told him I had a recording of him telling her she was fading fast and to just sign the damn papers while she was on high-dose morphine for the bone pain. The line went dead. I stood in the kitchen and drank my coffee. It was bitter. It was perfect. I looked out at the garden. The sun was hitting the lavender, turning the purple into something ethereal and bright. I realized then that Marcus wasn't just fighting for a house. He was fighting for the lie he had been told his entire life. He was fighting for the version of reality where he was the protagonist and I was just a footnote. If I won, he wasn't just homeless, he was ordinary. And for a Mercer man, being ordinary was a death sentence. I spent the afternoon with a private security consultant. We walked the perimeter of the property together. He pointed out the vulnerabilities, the low fence in the back, the outdated window locks in the basement. I paid him in full, on the spot, using the account my mother had labeled for the walls. He seemed surprised by my lack of hesitation. I told him that I had spent 30 years feeling unsafe in this house, and I didn't intend to spend another day that way. By 4 p.m., a crew was installing high-definition cameras and motion sensor lights. Every time a drill bit into the siding, I felt a sense of closure. I was fortifying my life. I was making it mine. The mail arrived late. Among the bills and the flyers for lawn services was a thick envelope from an accounting firm. It wasn't addressed to me, it was for the Mercer Contracting Group. I almost threw it aside, but then I remembered what Elias had said. I was the landlord of the land the business sat on. I opened it. It was a quarterly audit report. I'm not an accountant, but I've spent years reading complex medical charts and spotting inconsistencies that mean the difference between life and death. I know how to look for patterns. What I saw in those columns wasn't just a business in trouble. It was a business being bled dry. Marcus hadn't just been entitled, he had been reckless. There were consulting fees paid to shell companies that led nowhere. There were personal expenses, trips to the Maldives, a kitchen remodel for Victoria, all billed as site development. My father had handed Marcus an empire, and Marcus had treated it like a personal piggy bank. If the business failed, the land I owned became a liability. Or an opportunity. I sat on the floor of the foyer, surrounded by my boxes and these incriminating papers, and I felt a new kind of power. My mother hadn't just given me a house. She had given me a front-row seat to my brother's self-destruction. I thought about the justice of it. I remembered a Christmas when I was 22. I had saved up for months to buy my mother a beautiful silk scarf from a boutique in the city. My father had looked at it and then handed Marcus the keys to a new Audi. He didn't even acknowledge my gift. Marcus had laughed and told me I should have spent the money on a car of my own, so he didn't have to keep giving me rides to the station. I looked at the audit report and realized the Audi was likely paid for with money meant for the employee's pension fund. The successful son was a fraud. He was a ghost. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the hardwood. I felt a sense of calm. The fear of Marcus's retaliation was still there, a low-level static in the background, but it was being drowned out by the clarity of the evidence in my hands. I wasn't just the girl who had been kicked out. I was the woman who held the thread that could unravel his entire world. I reached for my phone and dialed Elias Sterling. I told him we didn't just need to talk about the house anymore. We needed to talk about the business. We needed to talk about the END.AS. I hung up. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't panic. I walked to the monitor in the kitchen and checked the new feed. It was Marcus. He was standing by the boxes I hadn't moved in yet. He looked disheveled. He didn't look like he was there to fight. He looked like he was there to bargain. I watched him for a long time. I watched him touch the edge of one of the boxes, the one with my nursing textbooks. He pulled his hand back as if it were hot. He stood there in the fading light, a man who had everything and was realizing he had nothing. I didn't open the door. I didn't turn on the porch light. I just watched. This was the first time I had ever been the one looking down. And I realized that the view from the top wasn't about being better than him. It was about finally being free of him. Would you like me to write part 6? I watched the screen of the security monitor for a long time. Marcus looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched against the cooling evening air, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing the gravel of the driveway he no longer owned. He looked like a man who had finally realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid. I felt the audit report in my hand, the paper heavy and slick, a weapon I hadn't even known I was holding. He reached out to knock on the front door, his knuckles hovering just inches from the wood, before he pulled back. He knew. He knew that the sister who used to scramble to make him a sandwich when he came home late wouldn't be opening the door today. He knew the locks had changed, but more importantly, he knew the rules had changed. I stayed in the kitchen, the blue light of the monitor casting a ghostly glow over the counter where I used to measure out my mother's medications with surgical precision. My heart was a steady, rhythmic thrum in my chest, a clock ticking down the seconds of his relevance. He eventually turned around and walked back to his SUV, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. As his taillights faded into the darkness of Oak Ridge Lane, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. I sat down at the table and spread the audit documents out under the pendant light. The numbers were staggering. $600,000 in miscellaneous consulting fees over 3 years. $250,000 in unallocated equipment leases. It was a map of his greed, a paper trail of every time he thought he was too smart to be caught. My father had built Mercer contracting on a foundation of reputation and hard work, and Marcus had treated it like a dying star to be stripped for parts. I remembered a summer when I was 19, working 3 jobs to save for my second year of school. I had asked my father if I could do the bookkeeping for the company during the weekends to earn a bit more. He had laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and told me that women don't have the stomach for real numbers. He said Marcus would handle the finances because Marcus understood the weight of the legacy. He didn't understand anything. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my mother's face from a year ago. She was sitting in the sunroom, her hair mostly gone, her eyes sunken but unusually bright. She had asked me to bring her a specific old shoebox from the attic, one filled with receipts and bank statements from the 70s. I had thought she was just being nostalgic, looking for old photos or letters. But she had spent hours going through those papers, her pale fingers moving over the ink with a focus that bordered on the obsessive. She was comparing the past to the present. She was seeing the rot long before I did. I realized now that she wasn't just leaving me a house, she was leaving me the evidence. She had known that if she just gave me the house, Marcus would find a way to bleed me dry through the business. She had ensured that I held the leash. I picked up the phone and called Elias Sterling. It was late, but I knew he would answer. People like Elias don't sleep when the blood is in the water. I told him about the audit report I had found in the mail. I told him about the shell companies and the diverted funds. There was a silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm. Elias told me that this changed the nature of the game. We weren't just defending a will anymore. We were looking at corporate embezzlement and fiduciary breach. He told me that as the owner of the land the business operated on, I had the right to an emergency audit of the tenant's financial health to ensure the viability of the lease. He said we could freeze the business accounts by Monday morning. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, electric jolt that made my fingertips tingle. "Do it," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it sounded like a shout in the empty kitchen. The weekend was a blur of calculated silence. I didn't answer Marcus's texts. I didn't pick up the calls from our cousins or the old family friends who were suddenly deeply concerned about the rift. I spent the time cleaning the house, scrubbing away the scent of Marcus's cigars and Victoria's expensive perfumes. I moved my mother's favorite armchair back to its original spot by the window. I organized my nursing journals in the study. Every movement was a reclamation. I felt like I was waking up from a 30-year coma. I realized how much of my life I had spent apologizing for my existence, for being the wrong child, for being the one who stayed when everyone else left. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back didn't look like a victim. She looked like a predator. On Monday morning, I met Elias at his office. He looked even more formidable in the daylight, his silver hair groomed to perfection, his eyes 2 chips of flint. He handed me a stack of folders. He had been busy. Not only had he filed the emergency audit, but he had also contacted the board of the local contracting association. Marcus's reputation, the only thing he truly valued besides money, was already beginning to fracture. Elias told me that Marcus had tried to move a large sum of money into a private account in the Cayman Islands on Saturday night, but the bank had flagged it because of the pending estate litigation. He was trapped. He was a rat in a corner, and he was starting to bite. He's going to try to see you today, Elias warned. He'll go to the house. He knows he can't get through to me, so he'll try to get through to the sister he thinks he can manipulate. I told Elias I wasn't the sister he remembered. I drove home and waited. I sat on the back porch, watching the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the lawn. The air was still, heavy with the scent of coming rain. At 2 p.m., his SUV roared up the driveway, the tires screaming against the gravel. He didn't just knock this time. He pounded on the door, the sound echoing through the house like cannon fire. I didn't move. I stayed on the porch, my hands folded in my lap. I heard him shouting my name, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. He started kicking the door. The heavy oak held, a silent, sturdy witness to his failure. Then, he ran around to the back of the house. He saw me sitting there. He stopped, his chest heaving, his face a mottled, angry red. He looked pathetic. He started screaming about the accounts. He said I was killing the business our father had built. He said the employees wouldn't get paid on Friday because of me. He told me that their blood would be on my hands. I waited until he ran out of breath, until he was just standing there, gasping in the humid air. I looked at him and told him that the employees would be paid from the emergency trust Elias had set up. I told him that the only person not getting paid was him. I told him I knew about the consulting fees. I told him I knew about the Cayman account. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. I told him that for 32 years, I had watched him take everything and give nothing. I had watched him treat our mother like a nuisance and me like an employee. I told him that the weight of the legacy was finally going to crush him. He lunged toward the porch steps, his face twisted in a snarl, but he stopped when the high-pitched chirp of the security system's perimeter alarm went off. I pointed to the cameras. I told him that the police were already on their way for a restraining order violation and attempted trespassing. He looked at the cameras, then back at me, and I saw the moment the last of his arrogance died. It didn't go out with a bang. It went out with a whimper. He turned and ran. He didn't even get into his car. He just ran toward the end of the driveway, his expensive suit jacket flapping in the wind. I watched him go, a small, desperate figure disappearing into the suburban landscape. I felt a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow space where the anger used to be. It wasn't the victory I had imagined. It wasn't a moment of cinematic triumph. It was just over. I walked back into the house and closed the door. The silence was absolute. I went to the kitchen and started making a pot of tea. My hands were perfectly steady. I realized that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was the realization that the enemy was never as strong as you thought they were. They were just louder. I sat at the table and looked at the garden. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the glass like a code I was finally beginning to understand. I thought about the future. I had a house. I had the land. I had the evidence that would eventually put my brother behind bars or, at the very least, out of business for good. But more than that, I had the memory of my mother's hand in mine. I realized that she hadn't just protected me, she had challenged me. She had known that I needed to see the truth for myself to finally be free of the Mercer name. I was no longer a Mercer daughter. I was Brianna. And that was more than enough. Would you like me to write part 7? The legal system moves with a glacial, grinding slowness that can drive a person to the brink of madness. But when the foundation of a lie is as hollow as the one Marcus had built, the collapse happens with terrifying speed. By Thursday morning, the local news had picked up on the irregularities at Mercer Contracting Group. I sat in the kitchen, the very room where I had once been told to stay silent while the men talked business, and watched the headlines scroll across my tablet. The company's reputation, which my father had guarded like a religious relic, was being dismantled in the public eye. I felt a sharp, localized throb in my temples, a rhythmic reminder of the stress that had lived in my body for 3 decades. I gripped the edge of the granite countertop so hard my knuckles turned a ghostly white. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage, beating against the bone. I wasn't happy. I wasn't celebrating. I was finally, for the first time in my life, seeing the man behind the curtain. I remembered a dinner party my parents threw when I was 24. I had just graduated from nursing school and had landed a prestigious position in the oncology ward. I was proud. I was glowing. My father had stood at the head of the table, raised a glass of vintage scotch, and toasted Marcus for landing a mid-sized plumbing contract for a new housing development. He didn't mention my graduation. He didn't even look in my direction. When I finally found the courage to mention my new job during dessert, Marcus had laughed and told the guests that I was playing doctor and that it was good for me to have a little hobby until I found a husband. The table erupted in polite, patronizing laughter. I had stared at my plate, the chocolate torte tasting like ash in my mouth. That memory came back to me now, vivid and searing. It was the same taste of ash, but this time, it wasn't mine to swallow. The phone rang incessantly, a shrill, demanding sound that echoed through the high ceilings of the house. Most were from Marcus's associates, men who sounded like carbon copies of my father, their voices booming with a forced confidence that didn't quite reach their eyes. They wanted to know if the rumors were true. They wanted to know if the land was actually for sale. I didn't answer them. I let the machine take the calls, listening to their voices turn from patronizing to desperate as the hours ticked by. I realized then that they weren't worried about Marcus. They were worried about their own shares, their own reputations, their own fragile hold on the status quo. The patriarchal brotherhood was a circle of vultures, and Marcus was the one. Currently bleeding out in the center, Elias Sterling came over in the afternoon, bringing with him a stack of documents that felt like the final nails in the coffin. He sat in my mother's armchair, looking remarkably calm for a man who was dismantling an empire. He told me that Victoria had officially moved out of the apartment she and Marcus had been renting since I kicked them out. She had filed for legal separation and was claiming she had no knowledge of his financial discretions. I felt a flicker of something that felt dangerously like pity, but it vanished as soon as I remembered her lifting that wine glass in a mock toast while I stood in the rain. She was a survivor, just like me, but her survival was built on the backs of others. Mine was built on the truth. "He's broke," Brianna, Elias said, his voice flat and clinical. The shell companies were a Ponzi scheme. He was using new investor money to pay off the old debts from his personal spending. Without the house as collateral and the land as an asset, the banks pulled his lines of credit. He's looking at 20 years for fraud. I sat in the silence that followed. 20 years. A lifetime. I looked at the lavender garden through the window, the purple blooms swaying in the breeze. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to go out there and pull the weeds. I needed to touch the earth. I needed to feel something that wasn't a document or a legal threat. I walked out into the yard, the grass cool against my ankles. The smell of the earth was grounding, a primitive scent that reminded me that the world keeps turning even when dynasties fall. I knelt in the dirt and began to work. My hands were soon covered in soil, the grit under my nails a satisfying, tangible reality. I thought about the concept of entitlement. Psychologists say it's not something you're born with, it's something you're taught. Marcus had been taught that he was the sun and the rest of us were just planets meant to reflect his light. He didn't have the muscles for empathy because he never had to use them. He didn't know how to earn things because everything had been handed to him on a silver platter with his name engraved on the handle. Admitting he was wrong wasn't just a legal defeat for him, it was an existential one. To Marcus, being ordinary was a fate worse than death. A shadow fell over me, and for a second, my heart stopped. I thought he had come back. I thought I would have to face the rage one more time. But when I looked up, it was only a neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who had lived 3 houses down for 40 years. She was holding a small plate of cookies, her face a map of concerned wrinkles. She told me she had heard about the unpleasantness and that she was sorry for my loss. She didn't mean my parents, she meant the family. She told me she remembered seeing me out here in the middle of the night, helping my mother through her walks when she was too weak to stand. She said she always wondered why the son was never there. He was busy, I said. It was the shortest, truest thing I could say, Mrs. Gable nodded, a slow, knowing movement. She told me that the town was talking, but that most people knew the truth. They had seen the way my father treated me. They had seen the way Marcus strutted around like he owned the pavement. She patted my hand, her skin like parchment, and told me that my mother would be proud of me. I felt a lump form in my throat, a thick, aching pressure that made it hard to breathe. I hadn't cried through the whole reading. I hadn't cried when I saw the audit. But the kindness of a neighbor who had been watching from the sidelines for 30 years finally broke the dam. I sat in the dirt and let the tears fall, a quiet, steady stream that washed away the last of the resentment. By Friday, the Mercer Contracting Group sign was taken down from the office on Main Street. The land was mine, and I had already signed a lease agreement with a new, reputable firm that was interested in hiring the old employees, the honest ones who had been caught in the crossfire of Marcus's greed. I ensured that their pensions were protected, a move that Elias told me was unnecessarily generous. I told him it wasn't generosity, it was restitution. My father and brother had used those people as tools for their own enrichment. It was time they were treated like human beings. I spent the evening in my father's old study. It was my room now. I had replaced his heavy mahogany desk with a smaller, more elegant table made of reclaimed wood. I had filled the shelves with books on medical ethics, gardening, and history. I sat in the chair and looked at the empty space on the wall where his portrait used to hang. I didn't feel the need to replace it with a picture of myself. I didn't need a monument. I had the house. I had the garden. I had the peace. I received a letter from Marcus on Saturday morning. It wasn't sent from a lawyer's office. It was a handwritten note on a piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was erratic, the letters slanted and desperate. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for money. He said he needed $50,000 for a retainer for a better defense attorney. He told me that if I didn't help him, I was responsible for what happened next. He said I was the one with all the power now and that great power comes with great responsibility. He was quoting a movie to justify his own failure. I didn't answer the letter. I didn't even burn it. I just placed it in the folder with the rest of the legal documents. It was just more evidence of a man who refused to see the world as it was. I realized then that I could never save him. I could never make him see me as an equal. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and the bars were made of the very privilege he had used to oppress me. As the sun set on the first full week of my new life, I walked through the house, turning on the lamps one by one. The warm light filled the rooms, chasing away the shadows of the past 30 years. I felt a sense of completion. The war was over. The house was quiet. My mother's legacy wasn't just the money or the land. It was the freedom she had carved out for me. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the woman who had survived the storm and built a sanctuary from the wreckage. I sat on the front porch, the same place where I had stood in the rain just a few weeks ago. The air was warm and smelled of lavender and cut grass. I watched the stars begin to poke through the darkening sky, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast, indifferent universe. I felt small, but for the first time, that smallness didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like a part of something larger. I was Brianna Mercer, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Would you like me to write part 8? The silence in the house is no longer an absence of sound. It is a presence of peace. I walked through the foyer this morning, my bare feet pressing against the cool hardwood, and realized that I didn't have to listen for the heavy, judgmental tread of my father or the entitled shouting of my brother. The air was still. It was mine. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, the same spot where I used to hide when the arguments got too loud, and I looked at the front door. The new lock gleamed in the early morning light. It was solid. It was unyielding. It was the boundary I had spent a lifetime trying to build. Marcus's trial is set to begin in 3 months. Elias tells me the prosecution has more than enough evidence to ensure he won't be seeing the outside of a courtroom for a very long time. The Mercer legacy has become a cautionary tale in the local papers, a story of greed and the slow, quiet erosion of a family's soul. I read the articles sometimes, but the words feel like they're written about strangers. The Marcus they describe, the mastermind of a $500,000 fraud, isn't the brother I grew up with. My brother was just a boy who was told he was a king until he started to believe it. He didn't have the muscles for empathy. He didn't have the capacity for truth. He was a hollow man. I remember a day when I was 9 years old, a hot August afternoon that felt like it would never end. I had spent hours carefully tending to a small patch of marigolds I had planted behind the garage, away from my father's sight. They were bright orange and smelled of sun and dirt. Marcus had found them while playing with his friends. He didn't just step on them. He pulled them out by the roots, one by one, and threw them into the gravel. He told me that girls shouldn't be wasting space with things that didn't serve a purpose. My father had watched from the back porch and hadn't said a word. He had just adjusted his sunglasses and asked Marcus if he wanted to go get ice cream. I stood over the ruined flowers, my throat tight with a scream I wasn't allowed to let out. My mother had come out later, her face a mask of quiet sorrow, and handed me a new trowel. She told me to plant them deeper next time. She told me that some things grow better in the shade. She was talking about me. I realized this morning, as I watched the steam rise from my coffee, that my mother hadn't just been protecting me. She had been observing. She had spent decades watching the men in her life dismantle everything she valued, and she had realized that the only way to save the future was to bypass the present. She knew that if she confronted my father, she would be crushed. If she challenged Marcus, she would be ignored. So she went underground. She built a world of documents and trusts and secret accounts that functioned like a secondary root system. She waited until the tree was dead to let the new growth show. It was a masterpiece of patient, silent rebellion. It was love. I went to the hospital yesterday to pick up my new ID badge. I'm moving to the surgical floor, a place where the stakes are higher and the work is more demanding. I like the precision of it. I like the way the machines hum and the nurses move with a focused, quiet urgency. When the administrator handed me the card, she called me MS. Mercer. I hesitated for a second, my finger tracing the edge of the plastic. I thought about changing my name, about stripping away the last connection to a father who didn't want me and a brother who tried to break me. But then I looked at my reflection in the glass of the office door. I saw my mother's eyes. I saw the set of her jaw. I am a Mercer, but I am the version of a Mercer that actually matters. I am the one who stayed. The house feels lighter now that Victoria's furniture is gone. I've kept the room sparse, filled with light and the scent of the lavender from the garden. I spent the afternoon yesterday cleaning out the attic. I found a box of old home movies, the grainy kind that capture moments of manufactured happiness. I watched one on the old projector. There was a scene of a Christmas morning when I was 6. I was sitting in the corner, playing with a small wooden horse, while Marcus opened a mountain of gifts. My father was laughing, his arm around Marcus's shoulder. My mother was standing by the window, looking at the camera. She wasn't smiling. She looked like she was counting. I wonder now if that was the day she started the first account. I wonder if she saw the trajectory of our lives even then. I am 32 years old, and for the first time, I am not afraid of the silence. I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. I am not looking for a way to prove my worth to men who are no longer there to judge me. I am enough. I have always been enough. The world tells daughters that they are a secondary thought, a supporting character in a story about sons and legacies. But legacies aren't built on names. They are built on character. They are built on the moments when you choose to stay when it would be easier to run. They are built on the secrets mothers keep to ensure their daughters can finally speak. I want to speak to you now, the person who is listening to this. If you are sitting in a room that feels like a cage, if you are being told that your work and your heart and your very existence are a burden, I want you to know that they are lying to you. They are lying because they are afraid of your strength. They are lying because they know that if you ever realized who you truly were, their power would vanish like smoke. You are not a guest in your own life. You are the owner. You are the architect. And sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who are the most threatened by your light. Do not let them dim it. I walked out to the garden as the sun began to set, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. I knelt in the lavender and let the scent wrap around me. I felt the weight of the house behind me, a solid, grounding presence. I thought about Marcus in a cell, surrounded by the walls of his own making. I thought about my father in the ground, his legacy a pile of legal documents and public shame. And then I thought about my mother. I felt her there, in the rustle of the leaves and the coolness of the air. I whispered her name into the twilight. It wasn't a prayer, it was a promise. I am going to live the life she wanted for me. I am going to be loud enough to drown out their silence. I turned back toward the house, the windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. I walked up the porch steps and stopped at the door. I reached into my pocket and felt the key. I didn't have to check the lock. I knew it would open. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the sound of the deadbolt a final, satisfying click. The house was quiet. The house was peaceful. The house was mine. I am Brianna Mercer. I am a daughter, a nurse, and a survivor. But most of all, I am free. And that is the only legacy that has ever truly mattered. Would you like me to do anything else for you?